Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the special meeting of the Council of the Township of North Dundas, today being June 22nd, 2026, 2:30 p.m. I'm going to call the meeting, the special meeting is called to order at 2:30 p.m. All those in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, that's carried. I'm going to move to the adoption of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Moved by Councillor Annable, seconded by Deputy Mayor Bergeron, that the agenda be adopted as presented. All those in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, that's carried. Any disclosures of pecuniary interest in nature thereof? Seeing none. We have one delegation in front of us today, Watson Associates, and we have Sude Jean and Jean-Michael Stephen from Watson Associates. Welcome, gentlemen. If you'll come ahead, we'll start with your presentation. And if I could just, not a reminder, just a general request, make sure you speak into the microphone. Thank you. And the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Can you go to the next slide, Liam? Thank you, Mayor Fraser, and good afternoon, members of council. I'm just going to do a brief introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Watson & Associates. Today, I'm very excited. It's a significant milestone for the township's financial and infrastructure planning. Over the past several months, we've been working very closely with Watson & Associates on three key integrated financial plans that we're going to review today: the asset management plan, the water and wastewater rate study, and our overarching 10-year long-term financial plan. Before I hand the floor over to Sude and Sean Michael, I just want to provide a brief overview of why we're here, what these numbers mean, and the key takeaways to keep in mind. First and foremost, this is partly about meeting the provincial mandates that we have set for us. So for asset management planning and for various financial planning under water and wastewater, there are regulatory compliance that we need to do. And this is going towards achieving some of that, which they'll talk in a little bit more detail. But there are four key takeaways I think that would be important to keep in mind throughout this presentation. The first one is that the Township of North Dundas, we have a very substantial asset portfolio, but healthy. And they'll go through it shortly, that we have around $750 million worth of infrastructure that we manage here at North Dundas. 475 approximately in tax-supported assets like roads, bridges, facilities, and about 275 in rate-supported water and wastewater systems. Maintaining our services with these assets requires significant investment. And you'll see that over the next 10-year period, it's approximately $100 million for water and wastewater needs, $119 million in tax-supported assets. For the financial strategy over this next 10-year period, what's being recommended is something that's a little front-loaded. So you will see that there is an average increase that's forecasted of approximately 10% per year. But to avoid taking on excessive and expensive debt, you will see a recommendation that is more front-loaded. And so Watson & Associates will be able to walk through what that implication would be, and perhaps what some of the alternatives would look like if that approach wasn't taken. You'll see that with this strategy, in order to make these essential investments, we will need to utilize debt. And you'll see that approximately by 2034, it'll be about 70% of our provincially legislated annual repayment limit, 70% of our debt capacity to be utilized. So we would still have some wiggle room with this approach. And the last thing to keep in mind is the decision that will be before council at the end of all of this. You will be asked to officially receive and approve the plan. And part of that includes that strategy to close that infrastructure gap. And we talked about that a couple meetings ago. On average, what the municipality should be setting aside each year in order to maintain the assets that we have versus what we currently have available to do so today. And so part of this strategy to close that infrastructure gap is to make these recommended changes, which Watson will walk through, so that by 2034, this infrastructure annual funding gap is closed. This is also going to set the foundation for our annual budgeting processes going forward. So we're not going to be locked in or committed to anything that's decided on today, but it is going to be the foundation that we will go forward with. So with that in mind, I'd like to welcome Watson and Associates and turn it over to Sean Michael and Sude.
Thank you, Director Hewitt. Thank you, Director Hewitt. And I'd just like to reiterate what your last sentence or two about not being locked in, and that's a challenge we have with information being passed out. It does get skewed somewhat, but I want to make sure that people understand it's not locked in. It is a suggested path if we want to get through this in the most efficient way. This is the direction that is suggested we follow. But again, just for those out there that are paying attention online and those that are present, again, I can't say it often enough to understand that challenge that we face and the future challenge we will face. And this is the suggested direction. But again, future councils will have future ideas, and the challenges that we face as we move along need to be considered. So, saying all that, thank you very much. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So without repeating too much of that great introduction, just to highlight some of the background on this work and the different components. So we did start this work with the municipality back in 2025, and as you'll recall, it did come, a rate study and rate forecast did come forward to council last year. At that time, it was identified that the asset management plan would be being updated. That's work that Sude has led on our behalf, which he'll cover in the presentation a little bit later. And that would have impacts on what had been presented to council in terms of the rate forecast, and as well that the long-term financial plan for the tax-supported assets would be coming back to council as well. And so with this work in terms of the long-term financial plan being the financial plan for the tax-supported assets, and the rate study being the long-term financial plan for the water and wastewater rate-supported assets, these also represent the financial strategy required as part of the asset management plan. So in undertaking this work, it's looked at a forecast period from 2025 to 2034. Some of the key elements that have been embraced in this work is looking at what the forecast development will be in the township over that period, what the anticipated capital expenditures are, and what the available funding sources are to meet those expenditures, as well as to contribute towards reserves for future life cycle needs as identified through the asset management plan work. And also look at the operating cost implications of the growth and the infrastructure requirements. And ultimately, what are the tax, water, and wastewater rate impacts of meeting those forecast needs? What are the impacts on other financial metrics like the sustainability and sufficiency of those reserves, the debt funding that would be required, and what those implications are for your debt financing limits through the are identified by the province. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Great. So a little bit hard to see on the screen here, but this diagram illustrates the methodology that's utilized in both the rate study and long-term financial plan. And so what's laid out here is in the top left-hand corner in the dark blue boxes, that identifies that one of the first steps in understanding what is the proposed development that's going to occur over the forecast period in the township. As a result of that development, that has implications for what is the future property assessment growth in the township. That obviously will have an impact for what future tax revenues will be generated. That's identified in the orange box on the top center of the graph or chart. It also has implications for other non-tax related revenues such as miscellaneous user fees and charges, but more notably on the water wastewater side for your water and wastewater rate revenue. And then on the expenditure side in the green boxes, there's obviously implications with that growth for impacts on your program related operating costs. So certain portions of your expenditures are going to be impacted just generally by growth within the municipality. But then as well, that growth also impacts the infrastructure requirements that you're going to have in terms of improvements to roads and facilities, and notably in the water and wastewater side, additional expansions to the infrastructure capacity you have there to provide services within Winchester and Chesterville. And so with that, those additional infrastructure requirements, that has both an operating cost implication where there are additional operating costs to operate those facilities and infrastructure, but as well it has a funding need as well. So where we have additional capital infrastructure that needs to be funded when it's growth related, the primary funding sources available are development charges, which you have in place for tax supported assets, and for your water and wastewater infrastructure, your connection charges imposed under the Municipal Act that generate growth-related revenues for that infrastructure. In addition to those growth-related needs, there's the other replacement rehabilitation needs identified through the asset management plan that Sude will touch on in a bit more detail. And then there's the necessary funding sources for those. So there's the growth-related needs identified, but there's also long-term debt and transfers from reserves that are available to the municipality. And so when we look at those revenues identified earlier, as well as the different funding sources and operating costs, that then has a net financial. Oh. That is a net financial impact to the municipality that we need to look at in terms of what are the necessary tax or rate increases to meet that funding need. And so building off of the point that Marcus made earlier around the infrastructure funding gap, these two charts here illustrate what the implications are over the forecast period of trying to close that infrastructure funding gap, depending on where a municipality sits relative to their forecast needs. And so to explain, the green line on these two charts represent what the two microphones. The green line represents what the long-term average annual life cycle costs are of the infrastructure in a municipality. And the blue line represents what share of those costs would be currently funded with the rates and revenues that are in place in the municipality. And so on both of these charts, that shows that there would currently be a funding gap, being that difference between the green line and the blue line, as exists in most municipalities in Ontario as they're looking to close those infrastructure funding gaps. The dotted orange line represents not what are those long-term life cycle costs of the infrastructure, but what might you actually be expecting to spend in the next 10-year period. And as infrastructure, the actual replacement infrastructure doesn't follow a straight line. There's going to be peaks and valleys as some of the more significant infrastructure is required to be replaced. You might be in a period where your actual needs over the next 10-year period are less than what those long-term life cycle costs are, which is what is represented by the top chart. And the implications of closing that funding gap are that you're going to be putting more money towards reserves each year than you're actually spending. And so you'd be contributing to reserves and building reserves for future needs that are going to arise beyond the forecast period. The bottom illustration is looking at the inverse scenario where your actual capital needs are greater on an average annual basis than what your long-term life cycle costs are. So you're in a period where you have peak infrastructure needs. And in those periods, you're going to be drawing down reserves and issuing debt as we don't want to fund at those actual capital need levels, but fund at the long-term life cycle levels. So we don't have rates fluctuate up and down as capital needs arise. And that bottom illustration is the scenario that the township finds itself in now, looking at the next 10-year period, where your average annual needs that you're expecting are much greater than what those long-term needs are of the infrastructure. And so as was identified in the introduction, there is going to be the need for issuing additional debt. So to touch on some of the initial findings, first in terms of the anticipated development over the 10-year period, can I move that up? Oh, thank you. The growth forecast that we've looked at is based on the draft growth management strategy that was prepared for the counties, as well as further discussions with township staff around anticipated development in 2025 and 2026 and how that might proceed over the 10-year period. And so to be reflective of what's actually occurred and anticipated, no service growth has been identified in the forecast for 2025 and 2026, and we've made adjustments to gradually increase the anticipated development up to the growth management strategy levels by 2030 to reflect the downturn in housing that is being seen currently. And so over that period from 25 to 34, that would see growth of about 1,000 population over that period, accommodating about 431 new residential dwelling units. As we can see, the majority of those being in the serviced areas of Winchester and Chesterville, with about 85 units in the rural area. So then the implications of that growth on the property assessment, as well as the water and wastewater connections and water consumption, are important because on the tax side, obviously the property assessment is the base for how future tax revenues are collected. And on the water and wastewater side, your rates are imposed both on a per connection basis, based on your monthly meter charges that are the fixed component of the rate, as well as a variable component of the rate that is charged based on the water that is consumed. And so from a tax-supported side, over the forecast period, the total weighted property assessment would increase from about $1.8 billion to about $1.9 billion, about a 1.1% year-over-year average annual growth. In terms of the additional connections on the water and wastewater system, growth from about 1,915 connections to 2,240, about 32 connections on average each year. But again, as I mentioned, with the forecast being gradually increased over that period, that growth is more significant on the back end, the last 5 years of the forecast period. And then from a water consumption standpoint, increase about 0.6% per year, from about 949,000 cubic meters to about 1 million cubic meters by 2034. Again, a lower percentage there than the growth in weighted property assessment, largely because a significant share of the total water consumption is from your large industrial user, and we're not forecasting additional growth in that regard. So with that, I'll pass it over to Sade, who's going to go over the findings of the asset management plan.
Thank you, Sean Michael, and good afternoon, members of council, through your worship. Quite pleased today to be presenting the Township's 2025 or 2026 asset management plan. Starting off with a bit of regulatory context that hopefully illuminates why asset management planning has become such a frequent topic of discussion for municipalities as of late. So asset management planning really came to the forefront of municipal politics back in 2018 with the passing of Ontario Regulation 58817. The regulation, which now governs asset management planning for municipalities in Ontario, sets out a series of requirements for municipalities to meet in a phased manner, as illustrated by the Gantt chart on this slide. The first step to compliance was the development of a strategic asset management policy, which is a fairly high level statement of commitment to the various different asset management principles that the township will be adhering throughout its asset management planning journey. Now, I should highlight here that the OREG does require municipalities to review their strategic asset management policies on an every 5-year basis. The regulation does not require municipalities to necessarily update the policy, but it should be reviewed on an every 5-year basis to ensure that it is reflective of the municipalities, or in this case, the townships, ever-evolving asset management planning environment. Next, municipalities were required to prepare asset management plans for their core infrastructure assets by July 1st of 2022. And then for their non-core infrastructure assets by July 1st of 2024. The core infrastructure assets are specifically defined by the OREG as being roads, bridges, structural culverts, and any asset that is utilized in the provision of water, wastewater, or stormwater services. And then every other asset that the municipality or the township owns would be a non-core infrastructure asset. So those would be things like fleet and equipment assets, facilities, parks and rec assets. And these asset management plans required municipalities to include some summary level information about the state of the township's infrastructure, so things like asset quantities, asset ages, replacement cost valuations, asset condition. And also required municipalities to define their levels of service frameworks for each asset category. And I'll describe this in further detail as we move along with some quantification of how well assets were performing with respect to those service levels. And the township met both those requirements with the adoption of its 2022 asset management plan, which included both core and non-core infrastructure assets. So really those first set of asset management plans could be viewed as sort of intermediary plans or stepping stones that are leading us to the final set of requirements of the OREG. And the last set of requirements involve the development of a comprehensive asset management plan that includes all asset categories, so both core and non-core assets, and introduces two new components that weren't previously present. The first component is the identification of the levels of service that the municipality proposes to provide over the long term. And the second is a financial strategy to achieve and sustain those proposed levels of service that also identifies how capital investment requirements will be funded over the next 10 years. And lastly, similar to the requirement of the asset management policy, the asset management plans are also required to be reviewed on an every 5-year basis. However, unlike the requirement for the policy, the asset management plans are also required to be updated on an every 5-year basis. So for municipalities, asset management planning is not just important because it identifies a systematic approach to the management of assets, but also because upper levels of government have tied some really key sources of external capital financing to the completion of asset management plans. So in summary, the Canada Community Building Fund, which was formerly the federal gas tax, requires recipients to develop and implement an asset management plan to maintain eligibility. The Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, which is commonly known as OSIF, requires that annual funding allocations can be only spent on capital expenditures for core infrastructure assets that are also part of an asset management plan. And then finally, the Development Charges Act requires background studies to include an asset management plan that covers the assets whose capital costs are proposed to be recovered under the DC bylaw. And additionally, that asset management plan must also ensure that those assets are financially sustainable, meaning that the municipality must demonstrate an ability to fund the ongoing life cycle costs, or rather the ongoing life cycle needs of those growth-related assets over the long term. So the development of this asset management plan was really guided first and foremost by the regulation and was supported by various discussions and workshops that we held with township staff and comprehensive reviews of background documents and studies that the township has completed to date. And this slide illustrates the development process at a fairly high level. But I'll describe it in a little bit further detail. So the first step in the development of this asset management plan involved undertaking detailed reviews and analyses of the township's asset data. This included updating and refining the township's asset inventories and conducting reviews of engineering studies, such as the 2025 road needs study, the 2025 OSIM inspection reports on bridges and structural culverts, the 2022 building condition assessments, the most recent asset management plan prepared for water and wastewater assets by Aqua, and other relevant supporting documents as well. And what this allowed us to do was really develop a very comprehensive understanding of the state of the township's infrastructure. The second step involved the identification of proposed levels of service through consultations held with staff, and also led to the development of life cycle management strategies that would need to be employed to achieve and sustain those proposed service levels over the long term. And all of this work culminated first and foremost in the determination of the level of sustainable funding that should be provided to assets on an annual basis to fully fund the lifecycle management strategies. And that sustainable funding, annual funding amount is referred to as the annual funding target. And secondly, it also resulted in the development of 10-year capital expenditure forecast to support the proposed levels of service. And both of those elements I'll present in the next few slides. So jumping into the asset valuation, which is presented in this slide. So as Marcus previously mentioned, the township does own a vast and diverse array of infrastructure assets, the replacement of which is currently valued at just under $750 million. There are a variety of different asset categories that are included within the scope of this asset management plan as highlighted or summarized in the table on this slide. The largest or most prominent share of replacement cost is attributed to transportation assets at approximately $300 million, or approximately 40% of the overall share. This asset category, of course, includes all the township's road network, which comprises approximately 133 kilometers of asphalt roads, 136 kilometers of surface-treated roads, and asphalt roads, of course, being HCB roads, surface-treated roads, of course, being LCB roads. And then also includes 140 kilometers of gravel roads. Also included within the transportation asset category are the various different ancillary assets that exist on the road right-of-way, so things like sidewalks and street lights. And then lastly, this asset category also includes the township's 17 bridges and 28 structural culverts. The next two largest categories are water and wastewater assets, which include approximately 61 kilometers of water mains, approximately 40 kilometers of wastewater mains, and associated appurtenances. There's a variety of different water meters, two treatment facilities, two water treatment facilities, I should mention, 7 wastewater pumping station, 2 wastewater treatment lagoons, and a variety of other facilities for water assets as well. The next largest category is stormwater, which is valued at approximately $72 million, or represents approximately 10% of the overall share, and that category includes just under 40 kilometers of stormwater mains, a variety of different catch basins, and 8 stormwater management ponds. And the rest of the township's infrastructure, so namely facilities, fleet and equipment assets, parkland amenities, and land improvement assets, are valued at just north of $100 million and represent approximately 14% of the overall share. Now, that's all well and great. $750 million is a very large number. But what does that really mean for the typical tax and ratepayer in the township? So when we compare that the total replacement cost of assets to the assessed value of properties in the township, we see that the typical single-family detached house in the township would indirectly own approximately $110,000 of municipal infrastructure. And it is informative to view replacement costs in this manner because it highlights the infrastructure burden that is being placed on the typical residential property owner in the township. And that share of municipal infrastructure has an annual cost of ownership associated with it, which is not dissimilar to any asset that you and I might own, like a car or a house. More formally, what that means is that each and every property owner is responsible for funding the annual cost of consumption associated with their share of the township's infrastructure assets. So they're responsible for funding the ongoing life cycle costs, things like asset rehabilitations, asset replacements associated with their share of municipal infrastructure. And that really gets to the heart of what we would refer to as financial sustainability when we, in the context of asset management planning. So in the context of asset management planning, financial sustainability is ensuring that this annual cost of ownership is appropriately reflected in the tax rates and the water and wastewater rates that are levied annually on each and every property. And hopefully that does highlight the need to develop a really systematic approach to the management of infrastructure assets, which looks to maximize asset performance while minimizing that annual cost of ownership. So how do we establish such a systematic approach to the management of assets? So the first step is determining the levels of service or the outputs that assets are required to deliver over the long term. And this process involves the development of a levels of service framework, which consists of the three components as noted in the table on this slide. The first component is the service attribute, which describes the aspects or characteristics of the service that are important to the township and to end users. The second component is the level of service statement, which describes the township's intent in plain language and provides some additional details on what the municipality intends to deliver. And the final component is the technical levels of service that seeks to now quantify how performance with respect to the service attribute and the level of service statement will be measured. So in essence, what the community level of service statement does is qualitatively describe the service attribute, whereas the technical levels of service are not trying to quantify that service attribute. And in effect, the technical levels of service provide a direct linkage between the service that's being delivered and the assets that are providing it. So in a way, that the technical levels of service are a way of representing or a way of measuring how assets are performing in the delivery of municipal services. So let's tie this together with an example. We might say that the quality of the township's roadways is an important service attribute to end users. To further describe this attribute in plain English, we might say that it's important for the township to strive to provide a comfortable ride quality to all road users. Now, how do we really put this in terms that can be quantified by measuring asset performance? Well, we might say that the pavement condition index of roads is an important or relevant, excuse me, technical representation of quality as experienced by end users. So whereas in the previous asset management plans, we were only required to specify the current performance of these technical levels of service measures, now we're actually required to set some targets. So in this example, the target would be to maintain the road network average condition above a PCI rating of an 80, which is a relatively high PCI rating target, but it's given here for illustrative purposes. So now jumping into the actual levels of service or proposed levels of service for the township's infrastructure. So first and foremost for roads, and I should preface this by saying two things. First and foremost, what you see on these next few slides with respect to the proposed levels of service are high-level summaries of the various different technical metrics that are being utilized to define the levels of service frameworks. Those very detailed technical metrics are included within the body of the asset management plan report. However, they're being summarized here in order to get away from some of that technical jargon and really highlight the key drivers of infrastructure-related costs for council's consideration. So we're really trying to just distill all that technical jargon down into some easy-to-understand statements that are driving the analyses. So that's the first point. The second point before we jump into the actual levels of service is that for the most part, the general theme here is to maintain current levels of service other than for the township's paved roads. For the township's paved roads, there is a surface conversion program that is being included within the asset management plan, aligning with the policy direction that council has provided already. To convert all LCB roads to HCB surface over the next 10 years. So that is the one sort of level of service change that is being, or an increase to a level of service, I should say, that's being included within the asset management plan. But for other asset categories, the general theme is to maintain current levels of service. So with respect to roads, of course, we're striving to maintain, striving to provide a comfortable ride quality and a satisfactory user experience. That's the high level of service statement. And the life cycle management strategy for paved roads includes a variety of different mid-life cycle interventions and timely reconstructions to maintain those road surfaces in adequate condition. The capital expenditure forecast for paved roads does include the planned conversion of all surface treated roads to asphalt by 2036. And also, the strategy for gravel roads includes annual dust suppressant applications as well as re-graveling happening every 7 years. In addition to the sort of defined life cycle management strategies and the cost coming out from those, the replacements of road-related assets, so these are all the assets that, as I mentioned, exist on the road right-of-way, are happening in coordination with planned road work. And and rehabilitations are happening on an as-needed basis. And then lastly, for bridges and culverts, the life cycle management strategy includes the timely completion of rehabilitation and replacement activities as identified by the biennial or OSIM inspection reports. For facilities, we are looking at two sort of related service attributes. First being the capacity of facilities, so ensuring that the square footage or gross floor area of facilities are sufficient to meet the service demands of the community. And in consultations with staff, it was determined that the current facility capacities are sufficient, and so there are no facility expansions or consolidations or conversely, any reductions or demolitions included within the asset management plan. So we're maintaining the facilities portfolio as is. But alongside that, we want to ensure that facilities are maintained in high quality and adequate enough condition so that you're not facing shutdowns of facilities or portions of facilities. And so the life cycle management strategy does include the timely completion of rehabilitation and replacement activities related to all facility components. And those activities were initially identified through the recommendations provided in the 2022 building condition assessment, which were then further refined and reprioritized through staff-led assessment. So they have been updated based on staff's best estimates of the timing of those activities or the required timing of those activities. Now, I should say that with respect to facilities, the upcoming capital investment requirements are relatively significant. And to manage the immediate financial impacts, these require rehabilitation and replacement activities are proposed to be undertaken in a phased manner over the next 10 years. Then jumping into fleet equipment, parkland amenities, and land improvements, again, the general theme is to maintain assets at current service levels, which essentially means that we would be looking to replace assets as they reach the end of their useful service lives, which would also maintain them in a fair or better condition overall. Alongside the replacements as they reach the end of their service lives, it's also recommended that the township complete regular inspections and maintenance activities similar to how the township is operating currently, and also conduct regular reviews of asset condition to identify any assets that might be performing worse or better than expected. And then lastly, coming into stormwater, water, and wastewater assets, again, the general theme is to maintain current levels of service. And so the replacement and rehabilitation activities are planned as assets reach the end of their useful service life, so before they deteriorate into a poor or very poor condition state. I should mention here that there are approximately $7.4 million of stormwater mains that are currently in service beyond their useful service life expectations. So we would define those as being backlogged assets. And the replacement of these backlogged assets is forecast to be undertaken gradually over the next 10 years. So we're not looking to replace all that stormwater infrastructure in one shot to manage the financial impacts. It is happening sort of gradually over the next 10 years. And then, of course, in addition to all that age-based replacement, the life cycle management strategy does include the completion of major maintenance and capital activities identified by Aqua for water treatment components, the storage towers, wastewater pumping stations, and the wastewater treatment lagoons. So once we have set some targets for the outputs that assets will be required to deliver, we now need to consider the activities that need to be performed on assets over their full life cycles to achieve those targets. And this really is the next step in developing that systematic approach to the management of assets. And through this process, which is referred to as the full life cycle cost assessment, we're able to determine the total capital investment needs of assets over their entire lifespans. And expressing this total as an annual average for each asset gives that asset's annual cost of consumption. So that's so-called annual funding target for each asset. Now, what should be apparent is that the key driver of infrastructure-related costs really are the levels of service. And there is this sort of inextricable link that exists between infrastructure costs and the levels of service that we're looking to deliver. So now let's tie this sort of all together with an example. This slide illustrates the full life cycle of a road segment. Now, to preface the slide, I do want to mention that this is an example that's given for illustrative purposes to explain some underlying concepts. This is not any information that's directly related to the township's roads. We're going to be discussing the life cycle management strategy for all of the township's roads and the resulting funding targets in the next slide, but this is just to preempt that conversation and provide some context for that conversation. So starting off with the table on the right-hand side of this slide, we see the various different life cycle activities that this 1 kilometer road segment is required to undergo over its full life cycle, along with the life cycle year in which those activities are performed and the associated costs. So in this example, this 1 kilometer road segment undergoes 3 rounds of resurfacings prior to a reconstruction happening at the 80-year mark. And if we were to sum up all the various different costs of those activities, we see that the full life cycle cost of this 1 kilometer road segment, again, abstract example, but in this example, the full life cycle cost totals approximately $3.2 million. And then expressing that $3.2 million as an annual average over the full lifespan of this road segment, which is defined as the time till reconstruction, gives us that annual funding target amount of $40,000. So I do want to stress and emphasize this point that when we refer to the annual funding target, this is not an abstract number, right? Like we're not pulling these numbers out of thin air, so to speak. It very much represents the mathematical average, annual average, of the various different life cycle activities or the cost associated with the various different life cycle activities that assets are required to undergo over their entire lifespans. So if I could draw your attention to the chart on the top left-hand side of this slide, that chart shows how the condition of this road segment is expected to degrade over time. So if no life cycle activities are performed on this segment, it will reach a PCI rating of approximately 20, which is a condition-based trigger for reconstruction by year 47. However, if we were to perform all the various different life cycle activities identified in the table on the right-hand side, we see that not only are we able to extend the life of this road segment, but we're also able to maintain this road segment in a higher overall condition over its entire life cycle. And the bottom chart on the left-hand side of this slide shows the financial impacts associated with this life cycle management strategy. So the blue bars on that chart represent the cost associated with each of the life cycle activities identified in the table on the right-hand side. The green dashed line, which might be a little bit tough to see, but it is there, represents the annual funding target of $40,000. And then if I could draw your attention to what's happening in the background, so that sort of green mountain that's building and then declining and building in the background, that is the expected year-end reserve balance. And that reserve balance is derived utilizing 2 key assumptions that underlie the financial strategy for the township as well. First is that every year a contribution is made into the reserve equal to the annual funding target of $40,000. And second is that all life cycle activities are funded through this reserve. And so what you will see is that in the years between when life cycle activities are required to be performed, that reserve balance builds and builds and builds. And then when that life cycle activity happens, that reserve balance depletes. Now, what's really interesting is when you look at what's happening to that reserve balance at year 80. And at that point, that reserve balance sits at a value of $0, meaning that all reserve funds are fully utilized to fund the capital expenditures associated with this 1 kilometer road segment at the end of its life cycle. And as such, again, just to reemphasize, the annual funding target represents the average funding that's required annually to fully fund all the various different life cycle activities associated with a particular asset. Now, you will notice that there are periods between when life cycle activities are being performed that reserve balance builds up quite significantly. However, I think it's really important to recognize that as long as the contributions that are being made into the reserve are determined through a full life cycle cost assessment, we can rest assured that those reserve funds will be fully utilized as assets start reaching the end of their lifespans. And the last element on this chart is the black line, which represents the 10-year moving average of that asset's life cycle cost. So in each year, that the value of the black line represents the annual average of expenditures expected over the next 10 years. Now, it is interesting when we review how this line kind of moves and shifts throughout the 80-year lifespan. So if I could draw your attention to the intervening years between when life cycle activities are performed, you will see that that black line sits at a value of 0 quite often. And if we were in that time period and at that stage were to restrict our planning horizons to just 10 years, we might arrive at the conclusion that that asset actually requires no capital investment over the next 10 years. When in fact, if we were to extend our planning horizon, we see that there are some really high cost activities that are coming up, which hopefully illuminates why it's really important to not just restrict our planning horizon to any specified time frame and really assess the full life cycle cost of assets. So then now jumping into the actual analyses for the township, and first looking at tax-supported assets. So in total, the annual funding target for tax-supported assets sits at just under $10.8 million, the largest share of which is, of course, transportation assets. Within transportation assets for roads and structures, through staff consultations, we did develop a sort of a comprehensive life cycle management strategy, both for the township's paved roads as well as for its bridges and structural culverts. For road-related assets, the annual funding target is determined utilizing a useful life analysis, which is a really simple analysis where we take the replacement value of assets and essentially spread it out over the expected useful life of those assets, understanding that those assets aren't going to require any mid-life cycle rehabilitations. So the only life cycle activity associated with those types of assets is end-of-life replacement. And so the funding target calculation is just taking that replacement value and spreading it out over the useful life of the asset. Of course, for things like roads and structures, where there are a variety of different mid-life cycle activities, that analysis becomes a little bit more involved and more complicated. So for transportation assets, the annual funding target sits at just north of $6.4 million. And I should highlight here that the target for paved roads is calculated assuming that all surface treated roads will be upgraded to asphalt. For facilities, the funding target sits at just north of $1.6 million, and that was also determined using a useful life analysis. However, that useful life analysis looked at the various different facility components that exist in all of your various different buildings. And those facility components, some buildings have hundreds of components, some buildings have thousands of components. All of those components were identified through the 2022 building condition assessments, and some pricing of those components was adjusted and updated through staff consultations. And again, because the only major or the only life cycle activity associated with those components is eventual end-of-life replacement, the useful life analysis simply takes the current replacement value of those assets and spreads it out over the term of their expected useful service lives. And those service life values were also determined through the building condition assessments. And then similarly for fleet and equipment, parkland amenities, land improvement, stormwater assets, again, a useful life analysis. For fleet and equipment, we're looking at a funding target of just north of 1.4 million. Parkland amenities, approximately 150,000. Land improvements, approximately 90,000, and stormwater just north of $1 million. So in total, for tax-supported assets, just under $10.8 million in current 2026 dollars. Absolutely.
Just one thing to reiterate or look back. So the $10.747 million that you have as that annual life cycle funding target, that's similar to what you were saying on the last slide, that this isn't just looking at what's going to be needed over the next 10 years, but taking a look at all of these assets, even beyond the 10-year period. Setting a target at 10.8 would set us up to be able to pay for these life cycle renewals that are necessary even beyond the 10-year period.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, this very much is taking, and through your worship, this very much is taking a long-term view on assets. So we're not restricting our planning horizon to just the next 10 years, where we know that the township is facing a rather significant, or a period of rather significant capital investment requirements. We're looking even beyond that, because capital investments at the end of the day are cyclical. So once you're beyond this high capital investment requirement period, you will kind of face a relatively low capital investment requirement period, but that doesn't preclude the fact that you will eventually face another high capital investment requirement period. So what we're trying to do here is set you up with sufficient capacity in your capital reserve and reserve funds, so that the next time you face that period, you're not having to rely on unsustainable sources of capital financing, namely debt and any application-based grants, which is the current situation, as Sean Michael will detail. And then for water and wastewater assets, we're looking at an annual funding target of just north of $3.7 million. For linear infrastructure, the funding target was determined based on a useful life analysis, but for water treatment plants, water towers, the pumping station, and lagoons, we utilized an annual reinvestment rate equal to 2.1% of current replacement value, and that's based on the recommendations provided in the most recent Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, which provides a target range of annual reinvestment for these facilities. And then lastly, now looking at just the next 10 years, so the regulation does require municipalities to assess the life cycle expenditures over the next 10 years. And alongside identifying those life cycle expenditures, also develop a plan to fund those expenditures. And Sean Michael will detail the funding plan, but here are the life cycle expenditures. So in total, for tax-funded assets, we're looking at just under $112.4 million over the next 10 years. For roads, the life cycle expenditures were determined based on the recommendations provided in the 2022 Road Needs Study, and includes the cost of surface conversions from surface treated to asphalt, and also includes the cost of planned reconstructions of selected urban roads, which were identified through staff consultations. For structures, so these are your bridges and structural culverts, the capital investments were determined based on the recommendations provided in the most recent OSIM inspection reports. And then for road-related assets, understanding that the replacement of these assets really is very much tied to the rehabilitation or reconstruction of the road segment on which they're emplaced. The capital expenditure forecast includes an annual allowance to undertake those replacement and rehabilitations in coordination with planned road work, and that annual allowance changes every year based on the amount of road work that's completed in that given year. So for transportation assets, we're looking at a capital investment requirement of just under $42.5 million. For facilities, these life cycle requirements were identified through the building condition assessments, and understanding that those assessments are a couple of years old now, those recommended activities were reviewed, refined, and reprioritized by staff, considering the current physical condition of facility components. And so for facilities, we're looking at a capital investment requirement of just north of $36.3 million. And then for fleet and equipment, parkland amenities, land improvement assets, and stormwater assets, the life cycle expenditures were determined based on an age-based replacement forecast. So as I mentioned previously, the intent is to ensure that no assets remain in service beyond their expected useful service lives. And so we're planning to replace assets as they reach the end of their useful service lives. Now, with that being said, there are several assets that already are in service beyond their useful service lives, and those are defined as backlogged assets. So specifically, replacements of backlogged fleet and equipment and parkland amenities are forecast to be undertaken in 2027. Replacements of backlogged fencing and lighting assets are forecast to be undertaken gradually over the next 5 years. Backlogged stormwater mains are forecast, as I mentioned previously, forecast to be addressed gradually over the next 10 years. And there is also included within the forecast the replacement of underground stormwater infrastructure in coordination with planned reconstruction of those selected urban roads that I had mentioned earlier. And the last thing to mention is the closure of the landfill. And I do apologize that only one expenditure related to the landfill is highlighted here, although two expenditures are included within the forecast and the long-term financial plan. So there's the first tranche, which is the closure, happening in 2028 to the tune of approximately 1.5 million. But then there's a second tranche that's happening closer to 2034 to the tune of just north of $1 million. So both those are included, although I do apologize for not specifically stating the second tranche within this slide. And then lastly, looking at the life cycle expenditure forecast for water and wastewater assets, we're looking at just north of $46.3 million. And that forecast was determined based on, was determined through an age-based replacement forecast, but also includes costs associated with replacement of underground infrastructure, again with in coordination with the reconstruction of selected urban roads. The expenditures also include all the various different capital and major maintenance activities that were identified by Aqua for water and wastewater facilities. And then there are, again, several backlogged assets that are that need to be replaced, but the replacement is happening gradually over the next 10 years, from 2027 to 2036. Sorry. And with that, I will pass it off to Sean Michael.
Thanks, Sude. So I think it was really important to spend a fair bit of time there, because as we highlighted already, a really key theme here is that achieving or providing the funding to achieve and maintain the current proposed level of services really is a main driver of the financial plan being put forward in front of you this afternoon. So when we build off of the initial summary of the forecast growth and development and the asset management plan needs, we look at the other implications for the capital expenditures over the 2025 to 2034 period. What's been identified is $219 million in needs. We can see that about 54% of those are related to the tax-supported assets on the left-hand side of the pie chart in the orange and a small section in dark blue. And the other, roughly 46% of the cost being representative of the water and wastewater rate-supported infrastructure. The source of those needs, the majority of them come from the forecast 10-year needs, Sude mentioned, from the asset management plan. Those focus on the 2027 to 2034 period, being the share of that 10-year period the 10-year period for the asset management plan included in this 2025 to 2034 forecast. And that's been supplemented with the 2025 actual capital expenditures that the township incurred, the budgeted 2026 capital expenditures, and then some additional water and wastewater infrastructure needs that have been identified by staff to continue to provide services as the township grows, such as water distribution improvements and new wells, as well as some additional landfill expenditures as well identified by staff that were not included in the asset management plan forecast. So the capital funding sources that have been prepared based on the forecast development and rate increases are shown here for the tax, water, and wastewater infrastructure plans. They've been developed again with respect to that for the forecast rate increases that we'll touch on momentarily, as well as the availability of debt within the annual repayment limit that's set by the province, available grants, and the reserve funds as well. When looking at the availability of reserves as a funding source, we have utilized minimum balances within those reserves of approximately $1 million for tax and rate-supported services respectively. And the reason for that minimum reserve fund balance is to provide the township flexibility in terms of changes in actual capital cost with respect to what is anticipated, as well as other expenditures and needs that might arise that are not haven't currently been planned. So in aggregate, when we look at those costs across the three service areas, as we saw on the earlier slide, about $219 million in costs. The majority of those costs are going to be funded almost equally between reserves at $92 million and future debt at $93 million. The other major funding sources are connection charges. So those are the development fees for water and wastewater that are imposed under the Municipal Act at the time of development, as well as development charges at $2 million. And it's anticipated there would be various grants, primarily up for the water and wastewater infrastructure needs of just over $20 million over that period. And we can see from the debt standpoint, about $36 million of the $93 million being on the tax-supported assets, and the remainder being for the water and wastewater infrastructure.
Sean Michael, can you explain under the reserve portion how that works? Why, for example, the taxation and user fees aren't on this chart, and how they flow through the reserves within this table of the overall $92 million?
Sure, yeah. Thank you. So good clarification. So as the way we've presented this financial plan is that as revenue is collected through municipal taxes or through user rates, the share of that revenue that's being used as a source for capital funding, we would be modeling that first as a transfer to your capital reserves, and then being drawn from your capital reserves to fund your capital needs annually. So the line shown there for reserves is representative of the available funds that are coming from your user rates annually to your reserves, and then being used as a capital funding source. So in terms of the operating expenditures, they've been based on the township's 2025 operating budget and the impacts that have been modeled as a result of population employment growth and additional infrastructure. And so we've worked with township staff around what operating cost implications there would be of the additional expansionary water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as what impacts there would be to other township operating costs. So that includes looking at the various departmental budgets, what economies of scale we'd anticipate to see as growth occurs. So there's certain areas like within corporate services, for areas like HR and finance, where there would be impacts on those costs as a municipality grows, but it's not linear. You don't see a proportionate increase in those departmental budgets as a municipality grows. There are significant economies of scale that have been accounted for, but there's other areas where where those costs for things like recreation and culture are more directly tied to growth in population as you continue to provide those services on a per capita basis. And then other costs that are more directly tied to infrastructure, such as the operation of your water and wastewater infrastructure, or your maintenance of roads for things like winter maintenance, as example, that are more directly tied to the additional infrastructure that's added versus growth in population and employment. And so over the 10-year period from 25 to 34, including annual 3% inflationary increases, that would see the cost for your tax-related operating increasing from just under $13 million to $17.4 million, about a 3.4% annual increase. For water, increase from $1.1 million to $1.4 million annually, just over a 3% increase. And for wastewater infrastructure, an increase of about $900,000 to $1.2 million annually, 3.9% year-over-year average annual increase. So the life cycle funding targets that Sude went through in detail earlier have just been augmented then to add additional life cycle costs with respect to the additional infrastructure, growth-related infrastructure that's been included in the forecast period of 2034. And so when we look at the funding targets by 2034, which include that additional infrastructure, which is shown on the new lines identified in the chart, as well as 3% annual inflationary increases in 2034. That shows that at 2034, in those inflated dollars in that 2034 cost base, the tax-supported infrastructure would have a $13.7 million life cycle funding target. For water infrastructure, a $3.6 million life cycle funding target, and for wastewater infrastructure, a $2.2 million infrastructure funding target. So the other key element then is that really factors into the entire formulation of the financial plan and the front-loaded rate increases that were identified in the introduction, is the annual debt repayment limits that are set forth by the province. And so municipalities through legislation are limited to their annual debt financing costs, or their principal and interest costs related to issued debt, to be no more than 25% of their own source revenues. As of 2025, you're utilizing a very small share of that. Your debt payments in 2025 represent under 2% of your own source revenues. But with the addition of $93 million in additional debt over that forecast period, as well as committed debt for completed projects for the Chesterville Reservoir and the Winchester Main Street Sewage Pumping Station of $6.8 million in aggregate, that would increase the annual financing cost to 17.4% of own source revenues by 2034 in comparison to the 25% limitation. It should be noted that when we looked at the various rate increase scenarios and having a more uniform increase in rates over the forecast period versus a front-loaded approach, that would increase the requirement for additional debt significantly because of the lower revenues in the near term of the forecast period, and that would actually result in the township utilizing and actually exceeding slightly the 25% limitation. And so that was really the driver for front-loading some of the rate increases, is based on the forecast development and growth. You wouldn't be able to fund the infrastructure plan without having greater revenues in the near term. And we'll touch on what some other options could be to the municipality as well. And so to look at that illustratively in terms of those impacts on the annual repayment limit, this chart is showing in the bars what the annual debt payments would be annually from 2025 to 2034, and then above each bar showing what percentage that is of own source of own source revenues. And the orange line is showing what that annual debt repayment limit would be, which is the 25% of own source revenues. So this includes, the forecast of the repayment limit in the own source revenues includes the impacts of additional development as well as the proposed rate increases, which both have an upward impact on the total revenues within the township. And so we can see that the sort of significant increase in those annual debt payments over the near term of the forecast, as there are significant water, wastewater infrastructure needs that would require debt financing in the next 3 to 4 year period.
So the increase from 4.6 million to 8 million as annual debt repayment limit, just to reiterate what you're saying, that's driven by the own source revenue of the municipality. And so as our own source revenue rates, taxation, whatever, as those increases occur, that gives us more capacity to be able to borrow more.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. So, then in terms of the overall rate impact, so what's shown on this chart is bringing all of the annual capital and operating costs together. So on the graph at the top, it's illustrating for the tax-supported plan what we call the true operating costs are, which are in the gray section at the bottom of the stack chart, and then the capital-related operating costs, which are your transfers to reserves, and your annual debt financing costs, which are in the blue section for new debt and the red section for existing debt payments. What the black line is showing is what are the total operating costs plus the long-term average annual life cycle funding target over that forecast period, and it's increasing based on the inflationary increases and operating cost increases over that period. And so looking at the 2025 period, what we can see is that difference between the black line and the top of the red section is the current asset management plan funding gap, or that infrastructure gap that exists currently, which is about $8 million. And so looking at with growth and rate increases to close that gap over the forecast period, which you can see occurring by 2034, where those two sections now meet. In the table on the bottom of the chart, it's showing for the three main periods, 2026, 2030, and 2034, what is that change in forecasted weighted property assessment, the overall net levy requirement, which we can see increasing from about $11.8 million to about $25.5 million by 2034, and then what that forecast tax rate would be. And then really importantly, the bottom line in yellow is showing what is that average annual increase at those different time periods. So in 2026, you had an 8% tax rate increase. And then over the period from 2027 to 2030, this plan is premised on a 13% average annual tax rate increase, followed by a 5.1% increase from 2031 to 2034. So similar illustration then for water supported infrastructure and operating costs. We can see a current infrastructure gap of about $1.5 million, being the difference between the $1.7 million operating costs and the $3.2 million life cycle and operating cost funding target, with that gap closing over the forecast period with the growth in rates and development. And we can see with the blue section being the new debt payments, representing a significant share of the future operating costs of the township with the additional debt that would be required. In the table at the bottom of the chart, and we can see in 2026, you had about a 13.4% increase in the average residential bill based on the approved rates. From 2027 to 2030, this plan is premised on further 20% average annual increases in the residential bill. And from 31 to 34, about a 7.7% average annual increase in the residential bill thereafter. This is presented as an average annual residential bill increase because your bills are comprised of a fixed monthly component based on meter size and your volumetric component, which are increasing at slightly different rates. And then lastly, on wastewater, again, we see the current gap of about $800,000 being closed over that forecast period. The increase was about 10% in 2026. It would be about an 18% increase in the average residential bill for the 27 to 30 period, and about a 5.3% increase thereafter. So we see that same trend of the 2027 to 2030 period, much more significant rate increases to provide additional revenue to mitigate the amount of debt that would be required, and then lower rate increases thereafter to still meet the life cycle funding targets by 2034. So this chart then provides in detail the various components of the average annual tax and water and wastewater bills that your typical residential home would see. This is based on a home with an average assessed value, property assessment value of $343,000 roughly, and water consumption of 132 cubic meters per year. And so the top portion shows the forecast tax bill based on those parameters, which would increase from about $2,000 roughly to about $4,400 over the forecast period. And then we can see that from a percentage basis, that would be an increase of, as we saw already, 13% over the next 4 years and 5.1% for the last 4 years of the forecast period. For the water bill, that would increase from an average of $322, including the fixed and variable components, which are detailed there for you, to about $1,000 by 2034. And then for the wastewater bill, increasing from about $586 in 2025, $645 in 2026 currently, to just over $1,500 by 2034. So in aggregate for that, the total tax and water and wastewater bill, which would be reflective of a typical home in Winchester or Chesterville, increasing from just shy of $3,000 or maybe more appropriately $3,200 in 2026, up to just shy of $7,000 by 2034 at $6,982. From a percentage standpoint, again, that's a 10% average annual increase over the entirety of that period, but we can see that over the period from 2027 to 2030, that's closer to a 15% average annual increase and about a 5.5% average annual increase thereafter. And from a dollar amount in terms of what that means on an increase year over year in the total bill payable, we can see that ranges from 2027 to 2030 between about $477 and a $733 annual increase in that bill, and then that decreases over the last 4 years, being between $300 and $370 for the annual increase in the bill, with the lower percentage increases for that period. So in terms then of what does sort of all this mean in summary? So what are the main drivers of these cost increases and the necessity for these level of rate increases? It's primarily being driven by the levels of service and the asset management plan funding targets that have been identified. And as I mentioned, it really is the key driver here. These are the costs necessary to maintain that desired levels of service and the funding required to do so. The rate strategy to meet those costs is that average annual increase of 10%, with that front-loaded approach of about the 15% annual increases in the near term and 5.5% increases thereafter, with this strategy being proposed to try and reduce the reliance on the debt financing, as I mentioned, without options to mitigate the amount of debt, such as generating more revenues in the near term with higher rate increases. You would require more debt that would potentially push you above your provincially legislated limit. It provides you more financial flexibility in that regard. And with that financial flexibility, obviously being able to better manage unexpected capital needs and reducing that long-term borrowing. One of the key opportunities available to you, in addition to or in combination with the strategy of having higher rate increase in the near term, is looking at what other front-end financing opportunities there may be to you. So on the water and wastewater side, much of the major infrastructure needs are in response to the capacity and demands of new development to be able to service those and allow that development to proceed. As that is housing enabling infrastructure that is required for that capacity, the township would be encouraged to look at any front-end financing arrangements that can be negotiated with developers, where they might prepay their connection charges, as an example, to allow the municipality to have that money in advance of when the development occurs to be used as a funding source for that, for those key infrastructure investments, which would then mitigate the amount of debt that would have to be taken on and potentially allow you to have, to smooth out those rate increases versus having to front end them to the same extent. Also, where it would be appropriate for developers to actually construct that infrastructure on your behalf, that should be investigated as well. In those sorts of circumstances, there would then be credits typically granted to the developer in exchange for them constructing the infrastructure. They would not pay their connection charges in the future to offset the infrastructure they've constructed on your behalf. And so last sort of points there, just highlighting what some of the benefits are of looking at those front-end financing arrangements that I highlighted already for you. So finally, in terms of the recommendations coming from the asset management plan and the long-term financial plan and rate study, these primarily relate to the asset management plan itself. And so what's identified is that the township should receive the asset management plan that's prepared and approve that based on the key elements of eliminating the infrastructure funding gap by 2034 and the associated financial strategy that's been identified in the long-term financial plan and rate study reports. And then as part of the annual budget process, ensuring that capital funding is available to implement the asset management plan. And then following that, one of the requirements of Ontario Regulation 588.17 is that there are annual reviews and progress reports made to implement the asset management plan, and which would be a requirement of the township moving forward. So with that, that concludes our presentation. I appreciate the patience. I know it's been lengthy, but there's certainly a lot of really important information and foundational elements here that we wanted to make sure we gave the proper attention to.
Well, Sean Michael Sude, thank you very much for that presentation. It was very fulsome, lots of information provided, and that's the important stuff, that there was lots of information provided in a matter that was, I'm sure, clear to many, but not all. And but saying that, it was a well-done job. I don't want to say fantastic, because that puts a different spin on the whole matter. But I want to thank Director Hewitt, staff, our CAO, and everyone involved in providing the information to you and Sude to ensure that this was compiled and able to be presented. And I just look back and I look at our Director of Transportation and some of the challenges he's faced over the years on the roads, and how the communication was important to deliver that information to the public about the challenges, so there was a full understanding of why things had to be the way they were. But I'm going to turn it over to questions, and I see Councillor Lennox is waiting to go.
Yeah, pretty heavy. Lots of challenges, but thank you for highlighting them, and staff, thank you for bringing this up. It gives us a lot to think about come budget time. For you two, the report proposes front-loading property tax hikes at 13% annually from 27 to 2030, alongside with 20% water annual water rate increases. Have you modeled a smoother rate or a smooth rate scenario over 15 or 20 years to insulate those on fixed income from the immediate multi-year rate shock?
Yeah, great question. We did model that not over a 15 to 20 year period, but over a 10-year period of smoother rate increases. And that was a scenario where the amount of debt that would be required would push you over that 25% limit that the province legislates. And so if we were to model that increase over even a longer period, deferring that increase over a 15 to 20 year period, that would only exacerbate that problem even more so, because we'd be deferring those rate increases and therefore generating lower revenue in the near term, while having the desired effect of mitigating impacts on ratepayers in the near term. Based on the anticipated expenditures, it wouldn't be feasible as you'd be over your debt payment limits without looking at other funding sources such as additional grant funding if that's available, or front-end financing assistance from developers.
All right, perfect. So pretty much like, I believe it was slide 18 or et cetera, with your graph line showing debt repayment and recycling with the hypothetical road situation where if we created a buffer zone, now that can't happen and would just collapse within itself pretty much. Yeah.
Speak to that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so going back to, and through your worship, going back to the chart on slide 18, I think the situation that the...
I could have the slide number wrong, I'm just guessing.
Oh, I think you were referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, the chart showing the example of that 1 kilometer road segment with the funding targets, yeah?
Correct.
Let me just transition to that portion. Right. I think to sort of summarize what Sean Michael is highlighting is that the township is currently in a situation, if we were to relate this back to the bottom chart that we see on that slide, is that there are really no reserve funds or insufficient funds in capital reserve and reserve funds. And even though the financial strategy includes annual contributions being made into those reserves, even after the annual contributions are being made, the cost of the life cycle activities that are forecasted over the next 10 years are so significant that that is going to take a lot more than current funds held in reserves, as well as future contributions that are projected to be made into reserves. Now, where does all that money come from? Right, so part of it is coming from things like grants, part of it is coming from some other sources, but really what that leads to is an over-reliance in the short term on unsustainable sources of capital financing, primarily debt, right? And that's why you see that $93 million of debt. So really that's kind of the situation that the township is facing, is that there really aren't sufficient funds held in reserves, and even after we include the future contributions, the level of capital investment is just so great to maintain current levels of service that there is, in the near term, that over-reliance on unsustainable sources of capital finance. So hopefully that sort of clarifies.
No, it does. Thank you, Sade.
Yep.
One more question, if I could, Mr. Mayor. What specific financial or legislative risks would the township face if council voted to cap annual property tax increases at a lower threshold, such as 4 or 5%, and derive non-safety capital projects further down the road? Sean Michael kind of alluded to this, but I'm trying to close the loop for the non-accountants in the room.
Sure, yeah, great question. So the legislative, I guess there wouldn't be specifically legislative risks as long as, especially on the water and wastewater side, that you're continuing to manage that infrastructure and provide that safely. So that's the one, I say the one legislative, pretty significant risk is if you were to defer capital expenditures for water and wastewater infrastructure that's required to meet sort of your duty of care, providing that infrastructure safely, that would be a risk. So certainly you need to do that, but you're referring to obviously that non sort of core or essential infrastructure. And so in that standpoint, it's not the risk is essentially maybe start before the risks. So if your options, if you're looking at, do we have an ability to have lower tax rate increases? So you're looking then saying, how can we manage our expenditures differently? And so if you're managing your expenditures differently, you're essentially making a decision to say, we are going to potentially have lower levels of service than we currently have, and that this asset management plan has been prepared to meet. And so council certainly has within its discretion the ability to provide lower levels of service than you currently provide and have lower costs associated with those. But that's a decision for council to make.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Sean Michael. Thank you, Sade.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor Bergeron, then I believe Councillor Urick. Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I just want to make a couple of comments. I just want to make it clear that we have to have an asset management plan so that we as a township can apply for grants for these major core services. If we don't have this management plan, we don't qualify for grants. And we have professional help for us to apply for grants so that we can be more successful in getting grants. And so we're trying hard for that. Secondly, I see that you've done very conservative numbers for the growth. You have 431 for within 10 years. And I know that we have a lot of plans in the pipeline right now that will probably exceed those numbers up front. Not for the next 2 years because the new well just came on, and so construction was delayed for a couple of years, and it takes maybe 2 years to get the roads in and the infrastructure in place to get, the housing in place. And so I'm thinking that we will have more than 60-something units for the first not this year. Next year, 2027, we'll have some online, but from 28 on, I think we will have bigger numbers up front than what you're showing for growth. And I know that itself will impact, it will buffer the tax increases if we get that extra growth. And like the mayor said previously, just because we accept this, it just means that it's on the table. We have to have it in order to be able to apply for the grants. And also, really, really good job. Yeah, I was really impressed at the work that you did. And I know that you got a lot of participation from the staff, which took many hours, many weeks, whatever, but a long time coming. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Urick.
No, just more of an appreciated comment. Kind of stark reality of it all, but it is, it's nice to see, and is, as the Deputy Mayor alluded to, a mandate that we have one of these in place. But I think more than anything, it does kind of set a constructive path for the municipality, for council, for staff to just, kind of identify and highlight these things going forward. And, to a kind of an earlier comment based on Councillor Lennox's, it's kind of, council can dictate kind of levels of service, but then it's also what do the taxpayers expect, right? And there's a lot of armchair experts at times who want a lot but demand to pay little, and the frank reality of the situation is that's not the world we live in anymore. So it is imperative that we do kind of be as mindful as one can be with taxpayer dollars, but also recognizing that we are a rural, small municipality with perhaps more assets than we require at times. And therefore, that is another kind of big conversation, longer-term conversation, as this municipality continues to grow and heads into the future. But all that to say is thank you for this. It is quite a lot to digest, but thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Annable.
Just to comment, it was a lot of information to digest. I'm glad to see that there's the availability of some wiggle room on some of the policies. So it's a lot of work. Thank you very much, and we have some thinking to do.
Thank you. And before I wrap up my end, I just wanted to look at Director Ward. Only a question. Whenever I believe it was, I'm not sure, Sean Michael today talking about the landfill closure, I looked at Director Ward. If you could just explain that a bit further.
So feel free to jump in here. I'm not an expert, but so the landfill closure is an asset management tactic. We have to account for the landfill closure because it's an existing asset, but I do believe in the capital forecasting, the landfill expansion and the numbers we supplied to them are included. So they're kind of two separate items. So the asset management portfolio holds the landfill closure, which eventually will come to realization. And then there is a portion, obviously, for the landfill expansion, which we're doing over the next 10, 15 years, that is incorporated in this capital plan. So there's two different numbers in here.
Thank you, and I'm going to get to Director Ward in a second, Director Hewitt in a second. I just asked a question, Director Ward, because it does say 2028 landfill closure, and I just don't want people thinking we just undertook an expansion and we're looking at closing it in a couple of years. Just want to clarify that for all of us. Director Hewitt.
Thank you very much, Mayor Fraser. I was going to clarify that point during my staff report, but I'm glad it came up now. The numbers that they have worked into the analysis, they are correct. It was just a typo on the slide 24. It is part of the landfill expansion, and so those are the initial tranche of costs. And as Sude mentioned, the next tranche has also been included. It hasn't been written explicitly in the report, but it is part of the overall analysis. So it was meant to be landfill expansion.
Well, thank you for clarifying all that, both directors, because we all understand how that slippery slope of misunderstanding how it goes. I guess I'll wrap it up, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's been expressed by all that this is a much needed process that we had to go through. We need to go through this process. The province expects that we have our own house in order if they're going to be supporting us through any grant programs. I think that's the fairest way to say it. And this presentation today will allow us to continue doing what we do, but with a clear path set out in front of us with tough decisions to be made. But I do appreciate this being presented to the public. It does establish the challenges going forward to maintain the level of service that we have, to continue working towards water, wastewater, landfill expansion, transportation challenges, facility challenges, arenas, pools, all of those things that we hold near and dear to us in North Dundas. It establishes a path forward where this council, future councils, will have the opportunity to make decisions on based on the level of service that, to Councillor Urig's thought, that the tax base desires, the residents desire, and how council feels that's best managed. Saying that, thank you very much for the presentation, and have a good day.
Very welcome.
We'll jump into the staff report, and staff report from Director Hewitt, approval of the asset management plans, long-term financial plan, and wastewater rate study, and that's moved by Councillor Urig, seconded by Councillor that's moved by Councillor Lennox, seconded by Councillor Urig. Be resolved that Council receive and approve the asset management plan for tax-supported assets, the water and wastewater asset management plan and rate study, and the long-term financial plan as presented by Watson and Associates Economists Limited. Director Hewitt.
Thank you very much, Mayor Fraser. The background and information in the report is just a summary of the presentation that we just heard, so I don't have anything further to add. This is just to formally adopt our asset management plan, long-term financial plan, and water wastewater study. So then going forward, this will be the plan that we'll be using for future grant submissions, for future budgeting purposes, etc.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, that's carried. We're going to move into the ratification bylaw. Moved by Deputy Mayor Bergeron, seconded by Councillor Urig. Be it resolved that bylaw number 2026-47 to confirm the proceedings of council at its special meeting held on June 22nd, 2026 be passed and enacted. All those in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, that's carried. And before I move into adjournment, once again, I can't stress it enough, say it enough. This was a very important meeting tonight, this afternoon, and please spread the word that there is an asset management plan in front of us, and due consideration will be given to that. For the adjournment, moved by Councillor Lennox, seconded by Councillor Annabelle, that council adjourn at 4:09 p.m. to the call of the chair. All those in favor? Opposed? See none. That's carried. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good night.